Recording? All right. Hit that guy? All right. Cool. All right. Can you guys hear me okay? All right, I can hear me. So I'm just going to take a quick 10, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, talk about a project I've been working on called LootSuite. So LootSuite is a post-exploitation tool made for, there we go, better, made for continuous collection. So if you're familiar like with Cobalt Strike or any of those other red team tools, there's going to be a keylogger in there, and it's going to collect keystrokes and send them back on callback. The problem with that is you don't have control over how your exfil is stored and when it's exfilled, and how much memory you use when you do that. So LootSuite is essentially a protocol of multiple tools that, when used together, will give you a lot more flexibility on how you exfil things like clipboard collection and keystrokes and screenshots and pretty much anything you want to collect continuously. So not just like a one shot, but like over time, doing like long-term red team collection, right? So this is a kind of a SIGINT thing, right? So we want to control when and where we exfil our C2. So the way that this is implemented is that keystrokes, clipboard data, screenshots, those get sent over an IPC mechanism and stored in memory for a certain amount of time. And then as an operator, you can configure when that exfil is taken out, either by a trigger, by a memory store limit, like for say for example, you only want 20 megabytes of exfil in memory before you exfil it out. Or you could do it on a period. You say like every 12 hours, I just want all of my exfil to go back to my C2. And that could be, whatever you decide to collect, right? And the reason we want to do this is because we don't want our exfil traffic to be related to our C2 traffic. So, in fact, there should probably be separate domains, right? So there's probably no way you're going to read this from back here, but this is kind of like the software architecture design of this, and hopefully you'll see why it can be pretty powerful and pretty flexible when used properly. So one of the core aspects of this is that loot stash, which is the memory store, sits in a process, right? And it makes a direct TCP connection back to its processor, right? So we're not talking HTTP. It's not doing any kind of like C2 profile. It is a direct TCP connection. And you might be thinking that's really, really bad OPSEC. It would be if you just had it, directly connect. But we're assuming that you have some sort of tunnel, some SSH tunnel, some SOX proxy that'll facilitate that. And that's part of the design decision that when we're writing our PostEx tooling, we don't want to be solving the same problems every single time, right? We want to have discrete, small tools that do the right thing, right? And so in this case, I don't care how this gets to my C2 side. I just care that it can get there, and another tool will facilitate the OPSEC behavior that I want. But so we have a loot stash DLL that keeps a memory store, and it's going to open up either a TCP port or a named pipe that's going to listen for incoming data. We then have collector DLLs, like a keylogger DLL, a clipboard capture DLL, maybe a browser history DLL, that could be running in the same process or a different process that connect to that named pipe or that TCP port and stream that data into it. So you can have DLLs running in different processes or even on different hosts. And what you have is a centralized storage mechanism for all of your exfil on a red team engagement, right? And you can control how it gets exfilled. And then have, if you haven't seen the talk on Nemesis yet, our plan is to, once we ingest all this exfil, we're going to stream it to Nemesis for PostEx analysis, right? So right now we're eyeballing 4-5 collectors, but what we're going to be doing is putting out an SDK so that anyone can just write a collector that they want, right? So these are the first 5 that we can think of, but really anything you want to collect continuously on your red team, you can develop a collector for it. So right now we have implemented a cookie collector and a clipboard collector, and that's going to come out with like version 1. So let's go over like a basic deployment and what this would look like, right? So in our basic deployment, we're going to have an agent such as like Cobalt Strike or maybe a Apollo or like one of our Mythic agents sitting and running in a process, right? And we're going to say, hey, load this DLL. That's going to be our loot stash DLL, and it's going to initialize a whole block of memory that we configure. We're going to say, you know what? I want a 30 megabyte exfil store. And that store is going to hold everything from, keystrokes, clipboard data, whatever. And then we'll just run another collector DLL that runs in the same process. In that case, it's just going to talk over a named pipe, right? Even though it's in the same process, the contract is still a named pipe. And most of the work that's been done on this so far is the comms. So we're not using like any kind of silly XOR encryption. Every task is going to be signed with an asymmetric key pair. All of your data is going to be encrypted with an AES key that's stamped in per configuration. So pretty much all the comms are tight. Once it's encrypted with a private key in which the public key sits on the C2 side. So once your exfil is sitting in that memory store, it cannot be decrypted until it gets back to that C2, right? Because it's just all based on asymmetric encryption, right? And then whatever tunnel we want to set up, SSH, whatever. And kind of the cool flexible part about this is we're going to get into the next slide here, is that we can run this on multiple processes, but our stash doesn't even have to be on the same host. It can even be on the C2 side if we really want to. Every component of this tool suite can be run in isolation without needing like a whole framework. And these are just the way that we're productizing this is they're just DLLs, right? So this should be able to be used with any toolkit you want. We're not going to put it into a BOF. We're not going to put it into some like C2 specific format. These are just DLLs that you can run, right? So right now you could do named pipe or TCP port connections, and that's really just an OPSEC decision on how you want to get your data streaming into your LootSuite, right, or your loot stash. And when you do your collectors, though it's designed such that you can put them in the processes that make the most sense. For example, if you have a collector that's continuously watching cookies, you would want that living in Chrome, because Chrome is the process that's going to be opening handles to that cookie database. And what we can do is, because this is structured data that gets sent back to our C2, we can now do interesting things like, oh, you have continuous collection on cookie data, so every time a new cookie comes in, we can actually set up an alert on the C2 side and say, hey, a website that you care about just got a fresh cookie. That's only going to be good for 15 minutes, so launch a curl request or launch a GET request to go pull down that auth data that you need from that. And we could do the same thing with browser history with, for example, like OAuth tokens in the browser history. And so we can all of a sudden, we now have a programmatic pipeline of things we can do with the data that we collect in our red team, right? And it can even get more complicated, and that there's no rule that says a collector needs to be run on the same host, right? We can have collectors run on different hosts in the same network. We can have collectors running on different networks. If we really want to, we can put, loot stash on the C2 side, right? And so it's this kind of flexibility that we spent a lot of time engineering. So ultimately, there's nothing new about a keystroke logger. There's nothing new about a clipboard logger. The interesting part about this is just the engineering effort of making it flexible and configurable to be the most OPSEC aware that you can on a red team engagement, right? So when we talk about exfil, there's 3 ways right now that we support doing it. As I mentioned before, there's going to be a name pipe that sits open on Loot Stash itself, and that can issue tasking. That can accept tasking. So when you issue tasking, you can say things like, drop your memory store size, or give me everything you have. You can also configure LootSuite to write to disk if you want. So if the memory store gets too full, you could say, hey, you know what? Once the memory store hits this certain amount, encrypt it and write it to some sort of covert store on disk. And then when you trigger to exfil, you could say, give me everything on disk that comes off of it too. So highly configurable. You can also configure it to just run on a schedule. So you'd say, every 13 hours, I want this thing getting all my exfil out, right? And it could also be size triggered, right? And yep, like I mentioned, all tasking is signed. And when we configure LootSuite, we're going to configure it with a key pair every single time we configure it. So it's not just like one key per op. It's going to be actually 4 sets of asymmetric key pairs per deployment. And that ensures that your data that you're exfilling is safe and that you're never actually leaking client data when you exfil it out. All right. And so you might be wondering, where are we at right now? So everything on the target side, on the code that runs on target, is code complete. It's feature complete. It needs probably some more testing, but it does work. We can get data out and sent back over the network. Everything from here on out is just polished. So we need ways to get it ingested into Nemesis. We need good documentation, and we basically need a productization of it. On top of that, we'd like to put out an SDK for collectors so that we're not going to be responsible for developing all the collectors. We want the community to develop whatever they think is the most necessary for their op, right? So whatever the new thing that you want to collect is, you can add a collector for that. We do want Nemesis integration, and this is going to be a Mythic configurable tool. Even though it's not an agent in a classic sense, like you don't task it through Mythic, we still want that configuration pipeline to go through Mythic, where there's a good record of what was built and the hashes that were built and all that. So that's where we're at. I plan on doing some more work on it over the summer, and hopefully we'll get it out on GitHub probably by the fall. So cool. I think that's really about it.